Okay. How about now? All right, good. All right. All right, now we're ready. Just trying to get it to where I can control everything from up there and I can do it, but the problem is I've got to do connect the mixer all the way up here, which means we got to thread more cord back through there here to get it up there, and so we'll see. Anyway, all right, let's go ahead and start. We're in. I'm sorry about the delay. We're in lesson 3, and we're going to be talking a little bit today about Hebrew poetry, which sounds, depending on maybe if you like poetry, that's interesting. If you don't, maybe it's boring. And why are we doing this? But hopefully, we'll see some value as we go through and talk about some of these things. Uh, when we look at if you, by the way, did anybody get a chance to do any of the exercises in here? I know we don't always have a chance to do uh, some of the questions and answers. If you did, this will probably be a lot more interactive. If not, it's going to be me talking a lot, which is fine. I can do that. Um, but I do want to make some points as we get started. I'm going to kind of walk us through some of this as we go. I think the thing that jumped out the most to me out of this, and if we get nothing else out of this, it's that Hebrew poetry is not about rhyming, it is about rhyming thoughts, if you want to call it that. The idea that I'm going to take this thought and put it alongside this thought, and there's a couple of different ways, either to show you a different way of saying the same thing, a way of possibly saying it with more depth or more specificity, or even to show as a contrast. Anybody remember what that's called, by the way? The idea of taking two ideas and putting them next to each other for comparison. You remember what he called it in the book? Okay. Okay. Uh, the term is parallelism. That's it's one of the most important things in understanding the Psalms, but also if you read the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, any kind of poetic literature, the idea of parallelism is going to be very important. It's going to be something you're going to see a lot of times, and it helps me as I study this. When we think about why, when we read the Psalms, one of my biggest hangups for a long time, and still sometimes is how repetitive Psalms tend to be. And it can be, especially if you're just reading through the Psalms, it feels like, okay, the same thing over and over and over again. And it's probably a little bit different for us because if you think about some songs that you have known, your favorite songs growing up, whether it be hymns or just popular music, how much repetition do we use in our singing? A lot. Sometimes a lot, a lot. We don't notice it so much because we sing and there's a melody going on there. And so I wonder if maybe it seems more repetitive when we read the Psalms because we don't have the music in our heads in terms of how it's going. The melody is stripped away, and instead, basically, we're just left with the words. And there are going to be times when we find ourselves saying the same thing over again, sometimes the exact same words. Sometimes we'll rephrase something and say it again, and the important thing I think is to understand why that's happening and what we're supposed to get out of it, and why he's doing it. Some of the examples of some of this idea of rhyming thoughts in Psalm 6 verse 9, for example, the Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. What do we have here? We've got obviously the Lord and the Lord. We've got two identical things, but now we've got has heard my plea and accepts my prayers. Is there a distinction between those two things? Yeah, maybe a little bit. It's I don't know. There's some examples where I think you can look at it and say, I think he's trying to make a point, and we'll see some of those. But in cases like this, I mean, it's essentially saying the same thing. So he's using two different ways of expressing that for the purpose of emphasizing it. Yeah. There is, but that's a good point though, because when we think about it in the Bible, when we read about the Lord hearing someone, what do we mean by that? We mean that He's accepted it. So there's very much that idea of hearing and accepting being brought alongside themselves. So for God to hear, or for that matter, for God not to hear, That's kind of what we're talking about. Here's another example in Psalm 11, verse 4. The Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. All right. So we've got, I shouldn't have colored these in. So I should have made y'all answer, but they're pretty simple. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Now we're not using the exact same words though. We got the Lord and we got the Lord's throne. How would you how would you compare those two things, the Lord and the Lord's throne? How would you distinguish between the two, besides the fact that one's the Lord and the other's his throne? When we think about a throne, what do we mean?
Throne would be his authority.
Okay, his authority, his rule, his reign, something like that, his kingship. So you've got one term that really is kind of an echo or a representation or an elaboration, maybe, or something more specific, maybe, than the first. And then you've got these other two phrases that are paired as well. And you might think, if we weren't thinking about parallelism, we would think to ourselves, well, okay, well, these are just two different things. But the structure indicates that these two things are trying to be linked together. When we think about the Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord is in heaven, what's the implication there? Where's the Lord's holy temple? It's in heaven. It's linked. Now, I did notice something, by the way, that's kind of interesting about that, because you've got this is where there's actually a little bit of a chiasm in this one, because we've got the Lord and then we've got heaven. All right, where here's the Lord. Where does the Lord live? Is heaven. That is the literal representation of God's home, right? So now let's look at what else we got in the middle. His holy temple and his throne. What are we seeing here? What is the holy temple? Again, it's heaven, right? Is there a physical manifestation of the Lord? What was, I mean, obviously there is, right? It's the temple. It's a physical manifestation of heaven. It's the representation of heaven on earth. So now we've got the Lord is in his holy temple and the Lord's throne. All right, what's the whole point of having a throne again? It's a seat, it's something physical, it's something tangible. So he uses two images that people would understand and see. Okay, here's the temple. It's this big structure. It's intended to it shows awe and glory and reverence. And then we've got this throne, which signifies authority and grandeur and power. And those are earthly manifestations that we understand. And he says these are the Lord's, and then he makes the parallel and brings us up to the spiritual ideas of the Lord who's reigning in heaven and in heaven itself. So he uses these physical grounded images to bring us up to these exalted spiritual ideas. Does that make sense? You see little things like that I think are intended to be there. There's another example in Psalm 19, verse 1, which, by the way, if you looked in my notes, I also had written down not a chiasmus. Laura's heard me talk way more about chiasmus than she probably likes, and it's but she turns to me when she's looking at this. I don't think this is really a chiasmus. I'm like, yeah, I agree. I don't think it is either, unless the only thing I can think of is that if the Hebrew translation into English switched some of the words around. But anyway, we'll talk about chiasmus in a little bit. So we got the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. So now this is actually an interesting way of teaching something, because you've got the two very clear linkage, right? The heavens, the sky above. That's very clearly talking about the same thing, right? Now, if I told you, if I asked you if the glory of God, what is the glory of God defined as? Well, you can define it as a lot of things, but what does he define it here? His handiwork. Okay.
You can see where he's coming from now.
Okay.
The heavens declare the glory of God.
hmm
The sky above proclaims his handiwork.
Okay.
Could be the heavens. And he could be in the sky above.
Well,
You see what I'm saying?
yeah. I mean,
because they're very similar terms, all four of them.
well, there's a sense in which that's true. Uh, but I think the point about it is that one declares the other, that one points to the other, and so the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims His handiwork. Now it's that whole transitive property: if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Well, if the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky above or the heavens also declare the handiwork, Well, then that indicates to me that what the writer is trying to say is that the glory of God is his handiwork. How do I see the glory of God? Well, I look around. Everything that's there, everything that we see, declare God's glory. And so there's again another example where sometimes it's almost exactly the same thing. Sometimes it's got a slight variation, and sometimes it appears that there's an intention to link two things that aren't necessarily always linked together. But he wants to make sure that we understand that in this context they are. Uh, so so that gets us into this idea of parallelism, and he listed some different ones, and we can look at some of these just real briefly. If you've read the book, you kind of understand what's going on with these. Um, the first one is listed as synonymous parallelism. Parallelism. We've kind of talked about that. Psalm 24, verse 2. He has founded it upon the seas, established it upon the waters. It's kind of like what we see in Psalm 6, verse 9. I'm basically just going to two examples of saying essentially the same thing, right? Um, the second one that he uses, and the point that he makes, I think that's kind of good, is that it kind of goes into the things that we were just talking about. That Melvin Curry, which I've never met Melvin Curry, a lot of people know him, I know, but was he teaching there when you were there? And he makes this point that sometimes that second half is intended to intensify, or sometimes to dramatize, or sometimes to zoom in. So it may be the exact same thing. It may be intended to bring your mind into deeper focus, or as he says, concretize, if you want to make, if that's a word, the first phrase. And I like the idea that when we think about, uh, he gives the example of wrath to flaming fury. Well, what is wrath? Well, he's angry. Okay, well, what does that mean? That could be a lot of different things. Well, when I see flaming fury, I've got a lot more of a specific indication of what that wrath is going to mean, which I think is a lot like what we're talking about here when we talk about um, the Holy Temple and the Lord's throne. There's some, he's giving concrete things that we can look at to understand spiritual or maybe less defined concepts. So he talks about synonymous parallelism. He talks about antithetic parallelism. What is that? Anybody remember from the reading? Anybody know?
It's a thought or truth expressed or strengthened by contrast or opposition.
Okay. Uh, And his example, Psalm 16, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Okay, this is bad, this is good. Half of the book of Proverbs is this idea of antithetic parallelism. God gives grace to the humble, but the proud will be debased, or something along those lines. There's this contrast.
Verse 6.
Right. And so you're going to have there's going to be a lot of examples that are used here. Synthetic parallelism is kind of interesting as well. Um, the idea of teaching a relationship, and he used Psalm 119 verses 11 as an example of that, where he says, "Your word I have hidden in my heart that I might not sin against you." Uh, the idea of cause and effect. I did this so that this will be the outcome. And so we'll see a lot of that, particularly when we start to get into the teaching psalms. Those happen quite a lot. So he listed a couple of the less common ones. Psalm 1, verse 1, which is a great example of a progressive psalm. The idea of walking, standing, and sitting. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, or stands in the path of the sinners, or sits in the seat of the scornful. Notice there's a progression there. There's a lot of different ways you could do a whole lesson on this psalm and the imagery there. But the idea, if I'm just walking past and giving a casual discussion, hey, how you doing? That's one level of fellowship. Well, if I stand and stop and chat for a little bit, that's a whole different one. Now, if I sit down and now clearly there's a very different. You start to see different levels of fellowship, different levels of association, and the idea that it just kind of keeps getting closer and closer and closer, and he gives a very different image. There's an irony, by the way, in that psalm. I'm getting away from it, but I just thought about this point, and I kind of like it in Psalm 1. He talks about the idea he's someone who walks, stands, and sits. In other words, his position is becoming more and more, I won't say permanent, but more and more entrenched, right? But in Psalm 1, who is the entrenched person? Who does the psalmist say is the one that's really entrenched, or who is really firmly rooted, if you will? Yeah, why? He says he's like a tree planted by the stream of water. He's not just sitting with these people. He is. He has roots, roots that are nourishing, that are bringing him up, that are providing him, that are allowing him to bear fruit and doing all these things. And the wicked who's sitting with the ungodly is actually nothing more than chaff because he's not being nourished. He's drying up, he's withering away, and he's going to basically eventually get blown away. So there's nothing secure or foundational about his relationship with the sinner, but your relationship with God is one that is going to bring you real security and real strength. So anyway, just a little bit of a side there. Um, the other one, climactic. I suspect I've never really noticed this one a lot. I suspect that it's probably there more than I realize. Psalm 29:1, give unto the Lord, you almighty ones, give unto the Lord glory and strength. The idea of kind of building a repetition it's almost like you take one sentence, break it up into two, and add the same words to the first part of both of them to kind of take you from one to the next. So we'll see that a lot. Um, the introverted psalm in Psalm 91:14, which kind of leads us into. I think I talk about chiasm next, don't I? No, I don't, but I may skip ahead for it. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him on high because he has known my name. You know what's the parallel statement to because he has set his love upon me?
What did you say is the introverted psalm?
Psalm 91 verse 14. Let's read that again. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him on high because he has known my name. So what's the parallel statement to because he has set his love upon me? Because he has known my name. What by the way, and this is a good example. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier in Psalm 19:1, that we put these parallel concepts together to maybe give us a little bit more insight. And what we see here is because he has set his love upon me, because he has known my name. What does it mean for me to know for God to know my name? It means that he loves. He knows who I am, but even more than that, he's set his love upon me. He knows me from a beneficial standpoint. There's a relationship that's being discussed. That goes back to again something like what we talked about in terms of hearing, the idea of knowing. When I'm known by the Lord, that implies a fellowship. That implies a relationship. When Jesus says, verily I'll say to you, I never knew you. I didn't have a relationship with you. And so that's that idea. And so then in the middle of the statement, therefore I will deliver him, I will set him on high. There's those two parallel statements there as well. Um, any thoughts, comments, questions? I'm just kind of breezing through these, but let's see. I want to go. Actually, no. I'll stay here, and we'll come back to this in a minute. The next one we've kind of talked about this. In terms of repetition. And Psalm 29 is a passage that he uses as an example of this. Let's look over Psalm 29. No, we're on 16. Or maybe I am. I guess we are. I'm sorry. Yes, we are. Page 14, and we're on Psalm 29. Is this That's the psalm that he includes here. And we won't read it all, but you can kind of see how each of the section, the voice of the Lord is over the waters, the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars, the voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire, the voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth. Each of this section kind of is elaborated on and gives us a different aspect of God's care and God's power. And it starts off, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, ascribe to the Lord the glory to his name, worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. And then it's basically, he almost gives four different examples of how to do that, or why to do that. So let's see. And we'll see a lot of examples of repetition. And I made this point, and if you did the homework and you looked at some of the songs in our songbook, and you can probably think of examples right now of songs that we sing that are pretty repetitious that use that same exact phrase. Especially, you see it a lot at the very beginning of the song, like in the first four verses of the song. It may start off with the same phrase each time, and then yeah, low in the grave he lay. Uh, well, that one, well, that changes. That changes in each one though. Well, Jesus, my Savior, though, comes back. So yeah, that's the repetition, I guess. Um, but I was trying to think. We praise thee, O God, uh, for the Son of Thy love, for the in okay, what are they? We praise thee, O God, for the Son of Thy love. We praise thee, O God, for the Spirit, for Thy Spirit of life. Um, of light. I love to tell the story is a great example of that. So we see a lot of examples that we use in our own songs. Wonderful story of love. Um, and those, if you think about what those are intended to do, that first line, it's like it emphasized over and over to the point that it always kind of sets our mind right at the beginning of the verse. We're set on that phrase, and that kind of keeps everything else in the context of that idea. And so that's kind of what they try to do in these psalms as well. Uh, Psalm 107. I want to spend a few minutes on Psalm 107. This is a one of my favorite psalms. I just find it very interesting in terms of how it's structured. Um, and he makes the point that there are a number of different repetitions of a phrase, and in this case, what it does is give us a little bit of a structure, and it's a lot like how we sing it, what we were just talking about. It will have a repeated phrase that it's at the beginning of the verse, or it's the conclusion of the verse that leads us into the chorus, or something along those lines. And the repeated verse, as he mentions in 8, it's in 15, it's in 21, and then in 31. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. And I like how this psalm is structured. He starts off in verse 1. In Psalm 107, verse 1. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. By the way, that exact phrase is repeated word for word. I want to say, was it 5 or 6 times in the Psalms? It's repeated a number of times. And he says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. And what he does now is he has, was it 4 sections? I think it's 4 sections where he's going to give you an example of that. All right. He's gathered in all sorts of people from the east, from the west, from the north, and from the south. There should be four because I think that would align with each one of the directions. In the first one, notice, all right, so here, he says, here's the first group. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city, finding no way to a city to dwell in, hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. So that's their problem. That's what they're confronted with. The solution, of course, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way until they reached a city to dwell in. So, in other words, he heard their cry, he saw their dilemma, he provided a solution for that dilemma. And it's in verse 8, there's that refrain, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous work to the children of man, for he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things. I like the linkage between verse 4 and 5. It describes them, wandering around. We have no home. We're hungry. We're thirsty. And now in verse 9, he satisfies the longing soul, the hungry soul, he fills with good things. So then we get the next section. Some sat in darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons. What are these people's problems? What they're in prison. Yeah, they're suffering imprisonment. They're in the shadow of death. And he tells them why. In fact, in verse 11, for they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the mighty. In other words, you're in prison and you're chained, and it's your fault. But what happens? They bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with none to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He brought, and we see the answer in verse 14. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he shattered the door of bronze and cuts into the bars of iron. He releases the prisoners. He breaks people out of bondage, even those who are in bondage of their own making. So you kind of see how that pattern works, and he goes through the next one. The some were fools of their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities suffered affliction. Well, what happens? In verse they cry out to the Lord, as all the other ones did. In verse 20, he sent out his word and healed them, delivered them from their destruction. And then, of course, the refrain. And 22, and let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of his deeds in song of joy. The last one, which seems to get quoted a lot, which and this is probably my favorite part of the psalm. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. Um, and you read this example, by the way, this will get into some of the imagery we're going to see later on. He says in verse 25, he commanded and raised the stormy winds, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. What what figure of speech would you say verse 26 is? They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Yeah, it's hyperbole. Obviously, the waves aren't going all the way up to heaven, and they're not going all the way down to hell. But when you read that, doesn't it kind of feel like they are? You really get the sense of what's going on, and there it says in verse 27, they reeled and staggered like drunken men, and they were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and He delivered them from their distress. If you'll notice, the it seems to me at least that the difficulty seems to be going up each time. It becomes more and more distressing until they get to this where you're completely at the mercy of the high seas. Uh, and by the way, does this sound familiar at all? I mean, the story that we're reading here. Yeah, and I think it's supposed to sound familiar because obviously we see this is exactly what's going on with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. I suspect there's some prophetic utterance that's going on here, and so he gives these four examples, one from each corner of the earth, a complete display or a complete depiction of God's redemption of his people, his ability to hear them. And in verse 33, he kind of sums it all up. He turns river into desert, fruitful land into salty waste. He keeps going on, says he basically has control over all this. And he says in verse 38, by his blessings they multiply greatly. He does not let their livestock diminish. And he's there for all of their needs. And finally, in verse 43, with all this in mind, he sums it up in verse 43. Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. And so it's just a great example, I think, of how some of the longer Psalms, you can kind of see how he structures it and how the repetition really helps you to understand, how he's trying to break this out and what he's trying to show. Uh, it becomes a little bit more, maybe a little bit more deep than it might otherwise be. Uh, oh, that's, there we go. I get a little pop-up window and it stopped me from doing anything. So the inclusio, he lists Psalm 8, but I picked Psalm 103 just because it's a little bit shorter. It kind of does, right? Inclusio, it probably is. Um, and you'll see this in other examples as well. It starts with verse 1, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. And it goes down in verse 22, bless the Lord, all his works, in all his places of his dominion, bless the Lord, O my soul. So that language, that phrase, bless the Lord, O my soul, begins and ends the psalm. And obviously, anytime you see that, that tells you right there that's the point of the psalm. That's the image that we're supposed to be getting. That's the effect that he wants to have on the reader. So that brings us to my favorite subject ever. And if you want to look over Psalm 46, because this is pretty good. And I will say, I'll acknowledge, I looked online to find one, to find a good example of this. But this is a really good example of how it's structured.
Like Scott, Psalm 19:1.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay.
They had us declare God's handiwork shows in the firmament.
Okay.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Yeah. He's got it. Well, he has, it's parallel, but
It's not a,
again, unless the Hebrew structure is different in Hebrew, maybe it is. I don't know. But since we can't read that, we're reading it in English, so it really doesn't help. But this is a good example. Psalm 46. Yeah, let's read this real quick. Psalm 46, where it says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roam and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose stream make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear. He burns the chariot with fire. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Uh, this is a good example of a passage that you really, at least for me, if I'm just reading along, I might not notice this. But as you study it a little bit, as you look at it a little bit more closely, you start to see a pattern because it starts off in verse 1 what God is a refuge. We see the idea of that because God is our refuge, we have no fear, we have no need of fear. And then we see examples in verse 3 through 4 that God is ruling over natural calamities. There's nothing in nature that God is not under his control. Verse 5, we see the idea that God is here. God's presence is in our midst. Uh, then you get to the middle, 6a and 6b. And that's really, I always say when you look at a chiasm, the, the main thing to get out of a chiasm to me is that you've got the beginning and the end and the middle. And the middle, a lot of times, is really the point that the writer is trying to make. And the point here is the nations rage and God speaks. And which one is going to prevail? Well, it's going to be God. So he says, the nations rage and God speaks in response. We see in verse 7 an echoing of the idea that God is here. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. We see verses 8 through 9. Now we see God ruling over political calamities, over the nations of this earth and all the things that they might be doing. Uh, Again, the idea of having no fear. Be still. Be still and know that I am God. You don't need to be worried about any of these things. And finally, again, in verse 11, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So, and by the way, that also is a repetition. It's verse 7 and verse 11 is also a repetition. So you could make an argument there might even be a chiasmus within a chiasmus here. I'd have to look and see, but so there's also a lot of times the structure can get pretty complex, but the idea is pretty simple, you know. And he's trying to emphasize that idea that God is our refuge, and it doesn't matter whether it's the problems that nature brings about, whether it's the problem that mankind brings about. The commonality of those is that God is with us in all of those. And so, eh, I always enjoy that kind of structure. But hopefully, as we see that at least help us to have a greater appreciation again. And again, it's not as if you can't read these songs and figure out these themes without that. But you kind of see how it's very much like with the idea of repetition, with the idea of all these other elements that it just underlines those things, it emphasizes them, it draws our attention to them more fully. And so we see anyway. So that's a chiasm, and we'll probably see, I'm sure, more of those as we go through. So let's look at some of the figures of speech. And since the person, whoever was going to do our invitation, is not here, so I guess we'll just kind of go through. um, so the first one's simile. All right, who wants to define a simile? And you can use an example if you'd rather not just define it.
A simile is comparing two things, usually with like, as, or than.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So um, we already read Psalm 1. He is like a tree planted by the water. You know,
Or the ungodly and chaff.
he's like the chaff. Uh, that idea that we can look at these two things, we see these comparisons. Now, the difference between that and a metaphor is what? Huh?
Say that they are.
They are. It is. It's. And I was thinking, well, why would you use a metaphor and not a simile, or why would you use one or the other? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that a metaphor has a little bit more of a striking emphasis to it, right? Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I guess that could be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
You wouldn't, you wouldn't say your heart is like gold.
yeah,
So saying
right,
it much stronger than
right, right,
like.
right. That's the one that jumped out to me the most. The Lord is my shepherd.
Isn't they is our shepherd?
He is, but we're not sheep. But again,
We are.
but we are again. But are we? Are we? But we're not literally sheep. But we are metaphorically, and that's the idea. Some metaphors are obviously a lot closer than others, and some metaphors you can extend probably a lot farther out and cover a lot more things than others. But the Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. And the whole idea is the metaphor is I'm a sheep, and the Lord is the shepherd. The next one we kind of talked about this a little bit, but hyperbole,
Exaggeration.
exaggeration.
It's so obvious.
Yeah, I can leap over a wall. David could not literally leap as far as I know. He could not literally. There is, by the way, a sense in which I always have to remind myself that when we think about hyperbole, we have to be a little careful because there's a lot of times when the Bible tells us that He empowered people to do some pretty incredible things. I could kill a lion with my bare hands. Is that hyperbole? Well, maybe. Not in David's case. Not in David's case, it wasn't though. Uh,
Tells the apostles that they'll be able to pick up venomous.
yeah, there's a lot of things that they were told that they could do. Um, but there are some examples, and like what was the? I think did I write it down? I probably didn't. If I did, it's in my notes. But the passage, well, Satan quotes. If you remember, Satan quotes the Psalms in Matthew chapter 4 during the temptation of Jesus, and it says, in fact, he quotes. It's Psalm 91. Okay, that's where it was. Psalm 91, where he says in verse 11, "For you will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion, the serpent you will trample underfoot." That's kind of alludes to what you were talking about earlier. Now, is this, in verse 9 and 10, for example, he says, "Because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge, no evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent." Is that hyperbole?
Where'd you get that from?
Psalm 91, verse 9 through 10.
I was looking at that before.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's when I said that he cited 91, and I went back to read that. Um, is that hyperbole?
No plague shall come near your tent.
Yeah.
No evil shall befall you.
Mhm. If you remember, uh, in fact, let me see if this has the reference to this. No, it's not there. Let's see.
Safety.
Yeah. It's a depiction of safety, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean that nothing bad will ever happen to anybody who's clearly not? There's now, having said that, I don't remember the specific verse, but if you remember in the law, the blessings and the curses that God says, your livestock will not, your mothers will not miscarry. Your livestock will be, you will, all these things will happen. And I'm not sure that, when you think about for example, in the wilderness, the soles of your shoes did not wear out, your garments did not tear, you always had food, all these other things that in a sense could sound hyperbolic, but in a context they could be actual promises. So it's kind of interesting where there's a sense in which when we talk about God in a hyperbolic sense, does God mean? I think Jesus kind of explains it pretty well in Matthew 4, doesn't he? Or at least he alludes to it. Is God really saying that if I put my trust in God and jump off a building, the angels are going to come down and catch me?
Well, if you tells him that's testing God.
Yeah. Is there a sense in which, well, does God watch over me providentially? Yeah, I believe He does. Does He? He doesn't keep everything bad from happening, but one of the themes of the Psalms, I think, that comes out more and more is that clearly David is, in many cases, calling out to God. You know, my enemies are surrounding me. I'm in trouble. They're, I'm in pain here. I'm mourning here. I'm hurting. Uh, and maybe I don't have deliverance right now, but the implication is that the deliverance is coming. And so when we read about God's care and God's providence in the Psalms, a lot of times what we're seeing is not so much about in every little aspect of my life as it is the larger picture of my life. Will I prevail in Christ? Yes, I will. Doesn't mean every day is going to be easy. Doesn't mean everything's going to go my way. But ultimately, I will be where God leads me. Because if we put our trust in the Lord, and that's kind of the idea. And I think that may be one of the most important things to get for a lot of reasons, because you start getting into the Psalms and people will for some reason will come to a Psalm like, for example, uh, when David said, I was born in iniquity, and sin did my mother conceive me." And yeah, no, that's very, very literal. Now they don't want to talk about the fact that Job, for example, and I think David also says, you know, I helped the widows from my youth, I helped them from my mother's lap. Well, wait a second, what did that's not literal? No, well, that's clearly figurative. You can't be a toddler and take care of the widows, but here this is literal. So it's important to understand that there is going to be a lot of hyperbole, and we don't have to get into the idea of okay, I'm going to sit here and defend doctrinally this very literal interpretation of the Book of Psalms, because that's not why it's written that way. It's not written that way to be understood in a literal sense. Now, again, people will say, well, so do you believe the Bible is literal? Do you take the Bible literally? Well, the Bible is a big book, and it's written in different ways. You know, do I take the Psalms literally? Like we talked about, there's some kind of shades of overlap there, but in general, we understand that there is exaggeration, there is hyperbole, and we're not going to take everything and say this absolutely all the time, 100% is going to happen. It's kind of like reading the book of Proverbs and going through all the list of things, and I can say, okay, I know when that didn't happen. I know what that didn't happen. I know that didn't happen, and we talk as if these things are, you know, carved in stone 100% of the time, will always happen that way, as opposed to what they're intended to be. So anyway, um, thoughts or comments to interrupt me talking? Uh, let's see. So hyperbole. These are the two that I kind of struggle with in terms of keeping them straight. Uh, they're very similar, and I in my mind I can kind of look at and say I can identify one or the other. I can't always explain why. But did somebody get a good definition of anthropomorphism?
Human characteristics given to a god or an animal.
Okay, okay,
Personification is applying a personal nature to a non-human.
okay. Yeah, and to me, I read that, I'm like, what's the difference between that? I'm not really sure. But for example, I could tell you, and I think I'm pretty accurate, that when we think about anthropomorphism, how many times do we read about, for example, the finger of God? Does God have a finger? No, he does not have a finger. He's not a physical being. The eyes of God, the ears of God, the arm of God, all these different things where God is given human attributes. And we see examples of this. He listed some examples I think it's Psalm 18:15, I think, the nostrils, uh, 15, where it talks about death. The cords are entangling me. The idea that death is personified, that it's leaping, it's lashing out with its cords and tying me up and trying to pull me down into the depths. Death becomes treated as a person. So I think we kind of understand that. Personification, uh, one of the examples I thought was good when he talks about my bones cry out. By the way, there may be some days that we kind of feel like our bones are, in fact, crying out, but they're not, but it feels like they are. And we understand what that means. Mhm. Yeah, my head is screaming. The moon smiles down on us. The idea of the waters feared is one of the examples that he uses. One of the ones that I didn't think it was, by the way, which is the one where it says, uh, he says, "Be not like the." Oh yeah, like I think it's Psalm 32 is the one that he uses that I would disagree with a little bit. Let's see if it's
35, 10, 77, 16, 96, 11.
under anthropomorphism. It's Psalm 32 verse 8. He says, in 8 and 9, he says, "I'll instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. By the way, there's anthropomorphism right there, and maybe that's what he was talking about because I got down to verse 9 and I thought he was immediately thought he was talking about the mule. Be not like a horse or a mule without understanding. There's a sense in which there's some personification, but at the same time, animals have a level of understanding. They know what a bridle is and they know what it's there for, and they respond to it when they're trained properly. But yeah, so the idea of giving God human characteristics to be able to whenever you see a description of the arm of God, what's typically the point? What's happening? It's doing something. It's his action. It's an expression of his power, right? When we think about the eyes of God, what are we talking about? You see his understanding, his insight, his knowledge of the things of this world. We think about the the heart of God. Obviously, we're talking about his emotion, his not his emotion, but his love, his care, his grace, um, the his character, his divine character, things of that nature. And so we kind of see how those things are going to be used. In fact, I think one of the examples was which one was it? Maybe it's later. Maybe I'm skipping ahead, but he listed a couple of passages that talk about keeping me as the apple of your eye. That phrase is used two or three times in the Bible, and the apple of your eye is referring to the I guess the cornea or the iris. I forget which one it is, but basically the sensitive part of the eye. And when he says, "Keep me as the apple of your eye," in other words, make sure you're going to do my. I'm going to priority one for me is to make sure nobody pokes me in the eye. That's I'm going to make sure that whatever's going on, that my eye is protected. And that's the idea. Keep me as something that is sensitive. Keep me something that is delicate. Keep me as someone who needs to be guarded. And that's the idea. So when you see examples like that, 17, Psalm 17:8. See, I wrote that down because I also added a couple. Oh yeah, it's back in under simile. Keep me as the apple of your eye. It's also mentioned in Zechariah 2 verse 8 and a couple of other passages. Um, all right, let's see. How are we doing on time? So anthropomorphism, we talked about this. Personification, we talked about that. I think that's where we are. Yeah. There were a couple of questions if anybody had an opportunity to do them. We probably, let's see, let's look at these. What was an example? All right. Question one, looking in the songbook for your worship, find a song whose chorus is identified for three or more verses. We kind of did that already, didn't we? I put I surrender all to Jesus I surrender, which is, and to make matters even more, emphasize the entire chorus. I surrender all. I surrender all. It's an answer. It's a call and response. It's very much like the Psalms because you have that structure not only of repetition but then of calling and answering back, which seems to be very much of that idea. Um, and the song, of course, that we're gonna sing is "Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah," which will be our closing song, which is frankly just filled with all kinds of imagery. I got made fun of, by the way, one time. A girl came to worship with me, and she's much more into you know modern praise music and things like that. And we sang "Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah," and she's like, "That song's about dragons. What do you? That makes no sense." And I don't think I can't remember if I actually pointed her to the psalm that says, "Here you go, dragons," right there. King James version calls it dragons. That's where that's from.
One small phrase
Yeah, yeah,
song, so she decided that the whole song
yes.
was about dragons.
No, no, no. She's. It was more like you're the one that's singing songs about dragons. That kind of thing. So uh, no, but the idea being again that it's it's nature crying out. It's nature calling out. It's ascribing to nature an appreciation for God. It's very much the idea of personification that we talked about. Um, anybody do what? Did anybody do one on number two, Psalm 6:9? Using that as your pattern, write your own two-line psalm or poem. All right, what was it?
The Lord is in his holy temple.
Mhm.
Jehovah exalts in his heavenly tabernacle.
Okay, okay, that's good. Anybody else do one? Just like, are you kidding me? Mine was the Lord has heard my cry; His ears are attuned to my request. So Using Psalm 9, verse 13,
19.
question 3. Using Psalm 19:1 as your pattern, see if you can write a verse about a worshipful thought of your own. Mine was, I delight in the words of your law. Your precepts bring peace to my soul. So we can all sound poetic. It's pretty easy. Did you do one?
The humble will be exalted by the mighty hand of God. Jehovah will uplift the lowly in heart.
Okay. Okay. Um, let's do, because we're about out of time. So let's go ahead and sing our song. Let's sing Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah. Thank you. Which is lifted out of Psalm 148, or at least part of it. I think all of it's based on Psalm 148. Hallelujah, praise Jehovah. From the heavens, praise his name. Praise Jehovah in the highest. All his angels praise proclaim. All his hosts together praise him. Sun and moon and stars on high. Praise him, O ye heavens of heaven, and ye floods above the sky. Let them praises give Jehovah, for his name alone is high. His glory is exalted, and his glory is exalted, and his glory is exalted far above the earth and sky. All ye fruitful trees and cedars, all ye hills mountains high, creeping things and beasts and cattle, birds that in the heavens fly, kings of earth and all ye people, princes, greaters, judges all. Praise his name, young men, maidens, and children small. Let them praise and give Jehovah, for his name is high, and his glory is exalted, and his glory is exalted, and his glory is exalted far above the earth and sky. So, announcements. Obviously, we've got a lot of people missing. Assuming Judy is still in her
Sue said when she saw Mark this morning, he said that she was poorly.
poorly. So, same. We know Dave and Jen's situation. Judy and Jim are not driving at night. Uh, Larry and Stephen are probably working. So, anything else we need to be mindful of?
Mark Roberts has a new grandbaby.
Yeah, good for Mark.
Well, it's a baby that needs.
Oh, well, he's going to be here in 2 weeks, so he'll probably have pictures, I would assume. Uh, that is, yeah, we got there's a brother, I don't remember his name, you saw it too. And I suspect he's not the only one. It's one of those things where you hear that and you're like, I want to help, but how many other people are there? How many people are we talking about that are in that same situation? Yeah, and maybe we can't, but we maybe we help some. So there's that. We do have our second Sunday. I've got some door hangers ordered. I need to go print out I'll have some flyers print out. I'll try to do some of the cards. I usually always have like, half a stack of those left. So I'll cut them down unless you guys feel like you're going to use them more than we did last time. I'll ask this Sunday, I guess, but well, they will be. Um, but anyway, I'm probably not going to print as many as I normally do. But we've got that. Um, and of course, our fourth Sunday series is coming out. Mark's going to be here. Uh, and so I'm looking forward to getting that started again. Some, yeah, I guess so. I guess so. 10 days. So, and then of course tomorrow at 10:30 at Ellison, we'll be there. What I'll probably do, you know, if everybody's great about doing the reading beforehand, then we can spend it going over and talking about things more specifically. My anticipation was that at least for now, I'm planning on going in and we'll just do do that week's reading and have conversation about it as we have time. If we can get past that and get to where everybody's done the reading and therefore we can just talk about things that came out of that, I think we'd be better off. But I also want to make sure that if we got folks that come in that, well, I didn't even know about this, and I don't want them to be lost. So at least it gives them a way to kind of to get integrated. So maybe at least for the first couple of weeks, it'll just be reading and some comments. We're not reading chronologically. We just decided to start Mark. I just used a New Testament reading program, and I did it. I picked one that would did not require 7 days a week reading every single day. It's 5 readings a week, and that way it's a little bit more paced. And if you fall behind, you can catch up. And so that's basically what Mark is a great place to start, though. I like starting with Mark because it is the most straightforward of the gospel accounts. It just basically it's action, 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 and you get right into it. You get into Matthew, and now we're starting to have conversations about the law in the Old Testament that not everybody has an understanding of that. You get into
About the Roman government.
yeah, yeah. Well, now that's going to be Mark too, and then
In Mark.
yeah, yeah, we'll start. Yeah, we'll start in Mark tomorrow. Did I know?
We're
I
not
Well, you might as well. I think.
very
Yeah,
reading.
yeah, we'll just start at the very beginning. Since we've yes.
Have some handouts for people. No, I have. I said.
I passed out. I left them a bunch. I can print out some more.
No, I mean, sure
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. We can have some more in case they. In fact, it's probably a good idea in case somebody comes in and doesn't have one. But hopefully, I mean, it sounds like at least people are asking about it, so that's good. That's at least something. So,
Sounds like doing the work.
well, and that's good. I mean, I'm trying to keep open in terms of how we approach it and how it goes, and a lot. I think the participation will probably determine a lot of that. But it's a start, and so we'll go from there. So I'm looking forward to that. So let's be praying for all those things. Anything else that we need to pray for? Pray for the doors. We're supposed to be getting new doors. I know. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to happen, but um, that's exciting. So we'll see. All right, Daniel, listen prayer. Lord, our Father in heaven, thank you for this evening, this time we've had study from your word, Father. Thank you for safe travels today, Father. Thank you for providing for us and keeping us all safe and healthy today. I'm mindful, Father, of those that are in California that have lost their homes and businesses. Father, we pray for your command and comfort. Help us to help them as we can, Father. Father, we pray for those that are of our number that are not feeling well. There are always some, Father. Judy, House, always, and others also. Linda and Louise. Father, as we depart, be with us. Grant us safe travels home. Be with us through this week. Help us, Father, to keep your commands and your will from our minds to make choices that you would have us to make. We pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.